high-tech system to read out what he said. Gareth Wally, talks of his manufacturing background, says, she has left us with a service economy. Is this not a castle built on sand? On the other hand, Sasan says, taxation, no one's talked about taxation, though taxation is a great benefit. There's a point for the opposition. Just before we move to the Q&A, let's announce the results of the voting, which you all did as you walked in. We had around 180 people cast a ballot. 86 voted for the motion, 61 voted against, and around 30 abstained. We'll see at the end whether those figures have changed. So now I'd like to move to a Q&A. Please do ask a question. We will take 1 or 3, depending on how many people have then. We have one in the back. Please do stand up and say your name before you ask the question.
David Atkinson. There's been a lot of talk about the 1970s in this debate, particularly about the Callaghan government specifically. The post-war consensus was just that. Many of the tenets of it were put in place by the Attlee government, and before that there was the what was known as the war communism. So I would like to ask, why is it that consensus that lasted 4 decades has been defined by the last 5 years of it?
Fantastic. Well, why don't I give that to you, Mark?
Well, there was a consensus, Butskellism as it was called, in which the difference between the Conservatives and the Labour Party until Margaret Thatcher was fairly minimal. There were nuances of difference, but it was how do you manage the economy? There was no suggestion that there should be widespread privatisation, for example. I can't remember back to it, predates me, but the Institute of Economic Affairs, my think tank, released a pamphlet in the 1960s, fairly moderate pamphlet, I think. So might it be possible, do we think, perhaps, to privatise the telecommunications industry? Everybody said we're completely mad. This will never ever happen. What sort of sophisticated developed country would ever have a privatised telecoms industry? It must, surely in the modern world, there must be a nationalised single state monopoly supplier of telephones and communications. Margaret Thatcher was the first person to say, I don't think this consensus is right or working. And she was correct in that regard. And by and large, I've got some sympathy with what Stefan said about the privatisation of the railways, which I think was handled catastrophically in the way they sold off. And so, in the spirit of a small amount of consensus, I'm not saying that if you just privatise anything, any which way, you are bound to get a better result. But generally speaking, those were the better results. When I were a lad, if you wanted to get a phone line installed in your house, you waited 6 weeks, at least, before anybody came around and put it in. That's what you got from a nationalised industry. Now you can go and buy any endless amount of mobile phones or switch your provider at the drop of a hat. Now some of that's technology, but some of that is marshalling technology. So I think Thatcher was right to point out that the consensus had failed, had finally collapsed, and broke apart that consensus. And I only hope, and I share Martin's fears, that we stay true to that analysis rather than sinking back into a soggy, high spend, high tax, high regulation, social democratic state, which is pretty much what we've had for the last 15 years.
Okay, brilliant. So that touches on one of the main points you made around privatisation. Your side seems to have largely viewed it as a success despite its moments. Stefan, really, would either of you like to come back on that? Not yet?
Oh, I think it's a mixed picture. I mean, I think that the orthodoxy, the consensus that was challenged about whether the state should have a hand in everything, I think that was a totally legitimate and sensible debate. Should the government run everything? No. But look where we are today. Energy, for example. We used to have something called the Central Electricity Generating Board, a national grid, and a national strategic approach to energy. Would that work better than what we have now? It's an open question. It's not a ridiculous question to ask. Should water be a commodity that people make a profit out of? We did, when we were angry in the 80s and talked about Thatcher's Britain, we asked that question and most of us were laughed out of the room because a new orthodoxy was being established about the supremacy of the markets and the supremacy of competition. But competition only works when you've got real markets. Didn't get into the introduction of so-called competition into the health service. Sometimes you don't actually want competition at all, you want collaboration. You want to actually, if I dare use the word, a collective effort to provide health and education to the country. So I think it's a mixed picture. I think we don't want the state owning the telephone company and taking more than 6 weeks sometimes to put the phone line in. I think that probably makes sense. But I think people are beginning to ask, how can we actually have a sustainable and affordable energy system for this country? And does the state have a role in that?
Thank you. Okay. Next question. We've got one here in the front. There's a lady here. And then we'll have you after. Please.
I wonder if the panel, which sides of the panel would possibly agree that privatisation has in fact opened the gates to the globalisation that has happened most recently and which is the biggest threat to us all. That our waters, for example, was sold to private individuals who immediately sold on their shares. The whole thing has now disappeared into the maelstrom of international, global economics, where we have no control whatsoever over what happens. The same with power, the same with almost everything.
Fantastic.
Privatisation wasn't a question of creating small businesses. It was a question of releasing nationally grown capital and allowing it to be sucked up into this global control whereby democracy has disappeared.
We've got globalisation, big problems there. Another question from the back, maybe? And there, we've got one here, gentlemen.
The term paradigm was used earlier, and I think in politics, as in life, there's always a paradigm of when you look at Thatcherism, was it a case of opportunities for more people owning their own houses, buying shares as individuals, or was it Thatcher's in a cabal, making millions? And I mean, that's a matter of opinion. But I suppose the main thing is about opportunity. And I wonder what the panel think in terms of a young person in the 1970s and a young person now. Okay, now they're going to be saddled with more debt. They're whether they're ever going to have a pension, etc., etc. It looks pretty bleak. But when you compare it to what a kid in the 1970s had in their future, do people now have more opportunity? Oh, sorry, which did they have more opportunities, and which were they better off in the 70s or now?
Okay, great. So opportunity, and finally we'll take one more. Alison?
Yeah, you compare the Thatcher government to a rather like socialist government. They were rather moving to the socialist kind of direction. But what about a big state in the sense of the Asian tigers, where you see state-led development, but in a rather developmental way?
Okay, thank you. So types of state development. So firstly, Martin, for the short way. There are too few safeguards when it came to privatisation.
Okay, well, so there's a whole spectrum of privatised businesses. Mark ran through a catalogue of what was privatised. If you want a hugely positive example of privatisation and globalisation linked together, take the car industry. Look at the British Leyland car and truck conglomerate of the 1970s, strike-torn, inefficient, producing cars that had no export potential at all, having to be constantly pumped with capital by the taxpayer to keep it going. Look at the globalized auto industry today. It's fantastically efficient. Some of the most efficient parts of it are in this country. Why are they in this country? Actually because Nissan and Toyota and Honda invested massively in this country in the Thatcher era because they had faith and belief in the Thatcher government to give them a good place to invest. So that's one end of the scale. At the other end, there are these regulated industries where true competition was barely possible. You can't really have competition between water suppliers. You can simply have regional water suppliers, and it has to be highly regulated. And in the post-Thatcher era, all of that, the regulation itself was too complex, too driven in the wrong directions. Things are not perfect in some areas, but there are whole big industries which should never have been in state hands, which were very badly managed, consuming taxpayers' money to no good effect, and which were turned into real businesses. Some of them then failed. British Steel, massive consumer of taxpayers' money, it could not survive in the global steel industry as it developed with much cheaper producers. But bits of it, specialist bits of it, survive. Some of it has even recovered a bit in recent years. It is subject to market forces, but what's wrong with market forces in real industries?
And can I ask both of you, we'll come to the side, to what extent the crash which came up in the banking sector and the privatisation of that area, for instance, Nigel Lawson famously announced the Big Bang and very much greeted in the whole deregulation of the banking sector. Is Thatcherism to blame for that? Not.
Well, no. I mean, I gave you the statistics about how heavily regulated it had become. Until the late 1970s, and lots of numbers here. Bank supervision was performed by the Bank of England with a team of about 30 employees. When the Bank of England was given statutory responsibility over banks in 1979, more than 80 people were engaged in the supervision of financial firms. In 1980, Thatcher had just become Prime Minister. There was one UK regulator for every 11,000 people employed in the UK financial sector. One regulator for every 11,000. By 2011, there was one regulator for every 300 people. This is the opposite of free market action. This is regulation going the other way. Heavier regulation, more regulators. It's extraordinary to actually suggest that this was a deregulated environment. I have to admit I failed, but I tried to look through sector by sector, the major sectors in the British economy, and try and work out which is the most regulated, which is the least regulated. It's extremely difficult to do, because you can't just count up the number of regulations. It depends how burdensome they are, it depends how heavily enforced they are. It's hard to do. But I was hoping, actually, that banking and financial services regulation would come out top, number one, the most regulated sector. I have to be honest with you, I don't think it is. I think it comes in number 2. So the most regulated sector is handling weapons-grade plutonium. The second most regulated sector is banking and financial services. Describe this however you want. It is not free market Thatcherism. And bailing out companies and banks that fail isn't free market Thatcherism either.
Let's move on. Vidya and Stefan, would you like to answer the opportunity to create?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence, the academic evidence about social mobility is that mobility has declined. So the chances of you outperforming your parents economically or socially in the 70s were greater than they are now. I think opportunity, and that really largely rests on the fact that the whole shape of the economy changed during that period. So kids that grew up with parents in manufacturing, dads particularly in manufacturing jobs, actually became middle class because the economy actually created a whole lot of white-collar jobs in that period, and that isn't going to be repeated again in the same way. So we had a huge economic transformation that actually enabled lots of people to become middle class and do desk jobs when their parents had done kind of manufacturing jobs. But I think there's at the same time, I think consumer opportunities are very different now to what they were in the 70s. We've heard some of that already. You know, consumer goods, all of that stuff is much cheaper, much more accessible. Technology, I think, is a major opportunity and enabler of so many things now that weren't there. So the basic sort of, if you look at the basic economic opportunity in terms of the chances of you kind of moving social class compared to your parents or moving economically compared to your parents, actually that's weakened. And the UK is quite a poor performer compared to other
Couldn't it be argued that's because...
Hang on, sorry,
parents
I just want to get round with the Q&A, so please do ask after the event. Let's have another round of questions. We've got one over in the corner there, we'll take first.
I've just got a question about kind of returning to the theme of consensus. If we look across the past sort of 33 years that we've been describing, we see broadly quite a neoliberal perspective on economics. Is it not within these two parties that we need to abandon Thatcherism so that we move away from this kind of agreement between each other and towards some real politics?
Okay, thank you. Do we have any towards the top? James.
James Aggregate. We touched on it briefly, but we haven't explored it in a lot of detail, so I'm curious on hearing the panel's opinions on Thatcher's views on Europe, and particularly on how the modern political parties are kind of interpreting it and putting that in their own light now.
And finally, one more, Robert?
This is for the arguing for the motion. There's a sort of inference in both of your arguments that there's this artificial creation of jobs at the moment in the private sector, and somehow the public sector is meant to solve this. But surely the only way that you can have a false boom in jobs is through the public sector, because it is financed through taxation and borrowing. It's not actually creating anything.
Okay, thank you. So booms are only public sector, are they? Let's see the panel's answer on that. So firstly, this first question touched on Alison about developing the state or developing politics in a new way. And is our debate misguided, Martin?
Let me pick up several threads out of those. So, very good point. Thank you very much. We had a boom in public sector jobs under Gordon Brown. It was funded entirely by borrowing and left the public finances in an absolutely crippled and chaotic state. So thank you very much for making that point. As to sort of Thatcherism and Europe, well, sort of, as I alluded to, true Thatcherism was very Atlanticist. It was very much to do with the personal chemistry between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. It was very much to do with the Cold War era. You were either on that side of the great divide in global politics, or you weren't. That era is rather over. Atlanticism isn't such a fashionable thing anymore. But the Thatcher suspicion of the great European folly, as it were, is still not only valid, but extraordinarily important to us. It's extraordinarily important that we're not in the single currency, that we resist the advance of the European super-state, the advance of European regulation, the European Court of Justice, all of these things impinging on our own polity, which is a fine and historic and extremely democratic polity and doesn't need improving by Europe. All we need with Europe is free trade, is a free exchange of goods and services, and indeed, and people. We can get onto that. But the Thatcherite resistance to the whole fundamental driving concepts of a sort of centre-left, big state Europe, especially when the single currency came into being, was a wholly valid instinct, and thank goodness we've still got strains of that in today's Conservative Party. I'll pause there.
I'll also try and match Martin and sort of hoover up everything in one go. Yes, paradoxically, there has been a kind of, if you like, a Thatcherite consensus, which is what I was hinting at, that New Labour, Mrs Thatcher was once asked, another piece of apocryphal statement, I believe it's true, what was her greatest achievement? And she said it was Tony Blair and New Labour, because they had accepted so much of what she had pushed through. But I would like to say something in favour of the old consensus. It was a Conservative housing minister in the 1950s, called Harold Macmillan, who built, I think, 300,000 new homes a year. Not personally, but he made it. He was capable of many things. But when he pushed that through, remarkable. I mean, I do mourn the loss of the old Conservative Party, the One Nation Conservative Party, the civil, and the more pro-European Conservative Party that campaigned for a yes vote in 1975. In the early 80s, one of Harold Macmillan's final public utterances was his comment on this wave of privatisations that he saw happening. And he said, well, we've seen it all before when families fall upon hard times. He said, no. First the Georgian silver goes, the Cadillatos. They're famous, as you can kind of take it somewhere. It's famous recently, it's called Selling Off the Georgian Silver. What else? Europe, yes, very important. Then I'll stop. I think Europe is a club. The EU is a club. And if you're a member of a club, if you don't like the rules, you have to stay in the room and try and persuade other people constructively and in a civilized way that perhaps the rules need to change. And you won't get everything you like out of that club, but on the whole it's better staying in. Now, it's true that in 1975, I mean, Ted Heath, and then in 75, the country was told it is a free trade arrangement, it's a common market. And that's all it's about. And of course, it has become something deeper and bigger and wider and all the rest of it. That's true. But if you talk to the Norwegians or the Swiss or the countries who are out and want to enjoy free trade with it, well, they have to comply with the rules too. In Norway, they call it the government by fax machine. They sit by the fax or whatever device, wait for the latest directive from the EU. So I would say Britain is better off in with all the irritations and problems that come with it, because we want access to this free market and we want to be able to take part in it constructively. And this attitude that Mrs. Thatcher embodied of complaining from the sidelines and of being hostile, I think has done us in the long run very little good indeed.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, this question about the neoliberal consensus, I don't get this a lot, and I just wonder whether we're living on a different planet. I am a neoliberal. I am in no size, shape or form part of the consensus. I consider to be a completely lunatic maverick outright. I'm a neoliberal. I'm not part of the consensus at all. The consensus has increased taxation, massively increased government spending, and increased regulation over the past 15 or 20 years, over the entirety of my adult life. Whatever consensus has built that certainly isn't neoliberal. I would describe that as a sort of pragmatic consensus. That's what we've got. I keep hearing about the terrible things about the neoliberal consensus. I wish that bloody was one. There isn't. On this, sort of the old Tories who used to go around and not themselves personally building houses. This goes back to a point that Lydia made about sort of what have we done to replace the sort of social housing that people bought up. We don't need to replace it. There's still people bloody living there, right? I mean, it's not as if there needs to be a set amount of social housing. If somebody was living in a state-owned house and have now bought it themselves, they still have a roof over their head. And we have, in terms of social housing stock, the third highest percentage in all of Europe in the UK for social housing stock. Wait.
80 billion on housing benefits.
40 times, 4 times as much as Germany, more than twice the amount of Ireland. Nobody could say we lack for social housing, etc. We lack for housing. We lack for housing. Well, affordable housing.
As in housing that people can actually...
But the reason for that is planning restrictions, right? I mean, everybody talks about affordable housing. I mean, no private construction company builds unaffordable housing. Okay, you'd be out of business pretty quick if the housing you were building was unaffordable. Right? That is not a good business model. Products that you wish to produce have to actually be affordable. Otherwise, you're going to struggle to sell it. But we haven't built enough, and I think we need to massively liberalise planning to allow a lot more to be built. Despite all the NIMBYism and protect England's green and pleasant land, only 10% of England is developed and only 5% of it is under concrete. You don't need to move those figures very much higher in order to, I think, solve this land crisis. Not overnight, but over a number of years. Thatcher and Europe. This is very interesting one, because I thought Stefan's analysis in his speech was interesting, but I don't think historically accurate. I actually think that Europe is probably one of the areas where Thatcher was most ambivalent. Thatcher changed her mind a number of times about it. Her government famously was divided about EMU and heading to the Deutschmark. And she couldn't quite decide whether she was on the Nigel Lawson side or the Alan Waters side. She was an enthusiast initially for the single market. I understand towards the end of her life, actually towards the end of her career, she thought this was a mistake. Possibly even towards the end of her life, felt we should leave the European Union altogether. So actually Europe, to be the example of Thatcher's rampant dogmatism, I think it's the worst example. This is actually an area where she kept changing her mind and was relatively pragmatic. What she wanted out of it was, I think, what Martin was alluding to. Free trade, a good thing. Free movement of capital, free movement of labour, a good thing. Within certain parameters, I think she would have said, I'd be more liberal on that. Single market, good thing, absolutely fine that French people are investing in British electricity and English people are investing in French cheese, ought to be encouraged. But it doesn't require the kind of superstate structures. And so on this club, sort of, you stay in and fight the rules. Well, yeah, there's some sense in that. Obviously, at some point, there would be a breaking point. Forget whether the club's the European Union or the private members club you're a member of. At some point, you reach the conclusion, I've been banging my head on a brick wall, I'm getting nowhere, I don't like them, they don't like me, I'm moving out. And Thatcher, I think, was continually actually dilly-dallying and flip-flopping, rather pragmatically, around those issues from a free market perspective. Certainly not consistently dogmatic over her career.
Brilliant. Really, would you like to come back on that?
Just pick up on a few things. The point about jobs was not that it was an artificial creation. I'm not disagreeing that jobs are being created in the private sector. I was questioning the extent to which they were low paid, low quality, insecure jobs. So, you know, you've been sold a good story about job creation in the media by the government. Actually, a lot of those jobs are relatively poorly paid, relatively insecure, and then topped up by state subsidies through tax credits. So, you know, they're not neutral to cost to the government. So you said all the public sector jobs are funded by taxpayers, while all these low-paid private sector jobs are funded, are cross-subsidised by the state, because families then get tax credits so that they can actually afford to live, because their wages don't stretch very far. On housing, I kind of agree with you that planning could be freed up, but actually, a house builder builds slowly to keep the prices up. We've never built enough houses just by the private sector taking the lead. We've only ever built houses to keep up with demographic growth because the government's also played a role, and I don't think that's going to change. You know, in the middle of a big housing crisis when we're not building nearly enough houses, all of that major house builders are making massive profits and their shares are rising, and that's because they drip feed. They're not volume builders, they're margin builders. They build in order and release the houses slowly so the price stays up, and they kind of they inflate demand that way. And on Europe, a completely separate point. I think the legacy for me of Thatcher on Europe is partly one that I feel is negative to the Tory party. Every time they start having the internal fights about Europe, I kind of think, don't you get it? Most people in the country don't really care about this. Actually, people are worried about jobs and jobs in the NHS and various other things. And actually, Europe comes very low in most polls as to what people care about in politics. And so I think a lot of the legacy from Thatcher on Europe is actually sort of negative for the Tory party in terms of its obsession with Europe. I think we should just get over it.
Right, so to refocus the debate, Martin, we discussed recovery a bit. You're claiming the recovery has been strong enough, and it's actually very positive. Figures claiming it hasn't been. So to refocus the motion that Thatcherism must be abandoned, do you think those figures are wrong?
Is this our closing speeches?
These aren't your closing speeches. We're going to have one more round. I just wanted to ask you quickly.
I'm not claiming it's the fact.
It's the fact. There you go.
It's analytically accurate.
That's a neat debating manoeuvre, but it's absolutely nonsense. So, the jobs figures are real. The recovery has now been judged by the Governor of the Bank of England, the IMF, and various other sources to be a recovery that has momentum, and that is being driven in the private sector. It's absolute nonsense to say it's being driven by some incipient new boom in the housing sector. That isn't so. That's just a southeast of England factor. There is simply a turn of the global economic cycle going on. We're on the cycle, as it were, because we have a highly flexible labour market. We have a vigorous entrepreneurial sector, and we've got the right attitude. The French, who represent everything I think video has been praising this evening, are not on this recovery cycle. They're actually still going backwards. Their unemployment is still going up. Their taxes are crippling, and most bright young French people who'd like to be entrepreneurs are on the Eurotunnel as we speak. Moving to
Let's have on a motorcycle. Yeah. Let's have another round of questions. With Tom in the back.
So kind of central tenet of Thatcherism is that, and you mentioned it on the opposition side, is that the rich might get very rich, some people may get a little bit richer, and this is good because overall everyone's getting richer. But a group that's been left out of that analysis is the very bottom. Are we, without referring to the 1980s and kind of very much sticking in the present, are we still comfortable with the fact that keeping with Thatcherism may leave some people behind?
Thank you.
Right, I've got two questions.
Let's have one of them.
And morph them into one. In the presence of minimal state pushing towards deregulation, who looks up the legacy of equality in the society?
Equality. Okay, very similar question. Brilliant. And we'll have one more. So we'll just go to the back. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Final row.
Video talks about.
Can you speak up slightly? Sorry.
Video talks about the privatisation from the Thatcher being a bad thing, kind of being one of the things that led to this crisis. Should we renationalise? If so, what should we do with it? And how do we know that just because we renationalise something, it's going to be better than how it is when it's private?
Okay. Brilliant, thank you. So we're returning to that debate over privatisation and renationalisation. And the first question will touch on the idea of equality, opportunity, and social mobility, which we've been discussing. Can I ask the speakers to encapsulate those points in your closing statements? And as we have a bit of time, we'll extend it up to 3 minutes if you would like them. Take 2. And so we'll go in reverse order in which you spoke. So Martin, go first. Well, I wouldn't really. I think it sounds like the consensus to sit down.
Oh, excellent, excellent consensus.
Okay. Well, I think the point I want to come back to is the point about opportunity. I was astonished by the idea that opportunity was greater in the pre-Thatcher era than it is now. That seemed to be opportunity defined by the idea that if your dad was a manual worker in some failing, crippled, state-owned industry, you could become an office worker in some other part of the vast public sector, at least until such time as you were kind of replaced by a microchip and made redundant 20 years later. There is a problem of social mobility in this country. It's a problem which is very often traced back to the state of the state education system. There's a whole other debate. That's one of the last pockets that Thatcherism was never really able to get at and reform and drive towards excellence. So there is a deficit of skills, which is an issue in this country, of fundamental reading, writing, and arithmetic type skills, never mind the technical and engineering skills you need to be globally competitive. That's a whole other issue. There is a problem with social mobility. But if I compare, as I said, the state of the world as I was graduating and the state of the world today, the vast range of opportunities available to you as you graduate and leave university, the things you can do, particularly entrepreneurially, but particularly if you embrace some of the tenets of Thatcherism Mark and I have tried to paint for you this evening, the idea of living within your means, of saving, not loading yourself up with debt, of taking command of your own life and your own destiny and building your own future, then the prospects are infinite. They're great. And actually, you know, some will get rich and some will not get rich, but those who get rich can then become philanthropists. And yes, they can. Yes, they can. And they can pass on their knowledge to others and help people become entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs. And that is a model of Thatcherism which I urge you to embrace.
Thank you. Stefan.
Very good. Well, on this point of debt, perhaps the high point of Thatcherism in a way was in the late 1980s when Nigel Lawson-Fameson cut many of the top rates of tax, and we had the so-called loads of money society, and I'm afraid the sort of thrift that Alderman Roberts in Grantham wanted to imbue in his daughter Margaret Hilda all those years ago before the war were forgotten. And I'm afraid the sort of debt and credit cycle started then. Very good question there at the back about inequality. Again, Mrs. Thatcher's remark about no such thing as society has been slightly misrepresented. If you go back to the text, it was a woman's hour interview. It was quite a long and careful answer. But nonetheless, fundamentally, there was a question about the individual responsibility and downplaying of the collective identity, the social identity. And I think that's to all our cost. I think you're right. I think Thatcherism is partly about being much less bothered about inequality. And I think we're seeing that that's actually not necessarily a very good or a sustainable option either for one country or for the world, actually. Mrs. Thatcher, a formidable figure, of course. I don't mean to be disrespectful to her memory. We're old in her shadow. There was a question that implied very much that all political leaders since her have been in her shadow, and they have. They've either been sort of miserable tribute acts or just not up to it in the same way. She has dominated our politics. She continues to, which is why a debate like this is so important. I'm so glad so many of you have come. But I think there is such a thing as society, to contradict her famous phrase. I think we are generally all in it together, and that is a non-Thatcherite thing to say. And that's why I think it's important for us to move on. More of the same and harder, and no U-turns on Thatcherism is not a sensible option for us.
Thank you, Steph. So we've had opportunity for all, inequality on this side, Mark.
The first two questions on that last round were touching on something which I wish we touched on earlier in the debate. I think they're really important. Leaving people behind, or what the state does about equality. I think it's very, very important to define one's kind of moral terms, because I think that Thatcherites and people who are broadly supportive of free market capitalism have done themselves no favours by almost saying, yeah, devil take the hindmost. You know, it's going to be good for most of us. Obviously, a few people will starve to death, but you know, that's fecklessness for you. But I'm going to say something that I hope to address that, but I'm going to say something quite provocative. I don't care about equality per se, and I'm going to invite you to consider whether you can care about it or not by means of a thought experiment. Just imagine you had an economic policy, I don't have one, I wish I did, but you had an economic policy which at the pull of a lever would suddenly put half of the British population on an income of £1 billion a year, and the other half on an income of £1 million a year. Would you pull that lever? The gap between the richest half of society and the poorest half would be 1,000 to 1. If you're on £1 billion a year, you're earning 1,000 times more than someone on £1 million a year. So inequality would shoot up if you pulled that lever. But clearly, the people at the bottom, I would not be describing as being left behind. So I think my interest is in the absolute level of wealth of people at the bottom, not with the equality vis-à-vis the people at the top. So I don't mind as long as people at the bottom are improving and their status is improving, and I think that is a moral imperative for politicians and the state. But I don't get too het up on how equal we are. A world in which half of us are millionaires and half of us are billionaires, I think would be a better world than one we're in at the moment, even though it would be a less equal. I think there is such a thing as society. I'm with David Cameron on this. I just don't think it's the same thing as the state. And we shouldn't just allow those terms to roll in together. Civil society is important. Caring about your neighbour is important. Good practice. Sensible probably in your own interests. But we shouldn't leap from that to believe that politicians, bureaucrats, regulators, and people who spend our taxpayers' money know the answers. That's what the Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek would have called the fatal conceit. There is society. Society values us. We are not atomised individuals. All of our lives are dependent on getting on with each other, caring about each other, at least interacting with each other. That's not a selfish sort of work. What Thatcher analysed was that in order to improve our society, you need to transfer more power into the hands of ordinary men and women and have less power in producer interests and in the bureaucrats and the politicians who still, sadly, continue to run vast chunks of our society and our economy. And I think Margaret Thatcher was right. And to abandon that truth, I think, would be a grave error. So I beg you to oppose the motion that's taking effect.
Fantastic. And finally, Lydia.
Okay, it's hard to know where to start. I think I would argue in proposing the motion that for the success of both in the UK, both economically and socially, what we need is a sense of shared growth. So what I'm not debating or disagreeing with are the headline macroeconomic statistics that have come out over the last week or so. Yes, jobs are growing. Yes, the economy's in recovery. It's growing, and that's a good thing. What I'm saying to you, and what people are saying, is that whilst the economy is growing, that's not a feeling that's shared by individuals. So when people's lived lives, they're not seeing their pay rise. Most people haven't had a real terms pay increase for 5 years now. They're still struggling to make ends meet, and they're still struggling to put food on the table and feed and clothe their kids. And that sort of unequal society that we've inherited, in part from some of Thatcher's legacy, actually is leaving people behind. And that is poor for the economy, because these are the consumers who drive the economy, but it's also a cost to the wider economy. Because actually there is a cost to leaving people behind, and that's not just in their own individual lives and the missed opportunities that they face, but in the problems and the social problems that follow from actually having a lot of people who are left behind. So I would argue that unless we move away from this idea that Mark put forward, that as long as the economy is growing, as long as everybody's getting better off, it doesn't really matter how well or how equally that growth is shared. I think we have to move to a situation where everybody sees the fruits of the growth that we make as a country. And whilst that isn't going to obviously be entirely equal, we need a better distribution of that growth to be both economically and socially successful as a country. So I would urge you to vote with the proposition that we need to move away from Thatcherism. Thank you.
Okay, well now for the key part of the night, let me just remind you all what the vote was before. We had 86 voting for the proposition that Thatcherism must be abandoned to save the British economy, against 61, so nearly 45, against, with 30 abstentions. So we have around 180 of you in the room. Let's see how that vote has changed. Now, if you, for all those put their hands up voting for the motion, you guys help count. Just bear with us 1 minute.
This is how the unions used to do it.
It's just one bloke with a block.
Derek Robinson.
Keep your hands up, please don't change your votes. No, please don't count it. Okay, we're thinking about 82, low 80s, so very similar numbers. And now all those against the motion.
Oh, yes.
Let's just have a-
Well, it's Thatcherite, isn't it?
Please keep your hands high. Sorry.
Put both of them up.
Okay, well, we think that the proposition just about have it, but on the other hand, we've had a swing of votes. We had 69 against, so our margin's gone from about 25 to 13. So choose your winner how you will. I suppose technically, the OC have carried that motion. Thank you.